Welcome to part 2 of chapter 10, talking about communication problems. So we just finished the first video talking about ways you respond to communication challenges and violations of expectations in relationships. Just to recap, we've got discussion, and that is when you're having conversations that revolve around, did something occur that was a violation of expectation? What was the actual rule or expectation that was broken? Did both parties understand the rule, which is key there, right? Because you have to explain your expectations because people might not understand that their expectation existed. And then, was the rule appropriate, applicable, and accepted? So was it something that both people mutually agreed upon? Do they understand that it was an expectation? Was it implicit or explicit? And what was the nature of the conversation that surrounded it? So that's the discussion that you have. Then you move on to either forgiveness, which is, why is forgiveness important in this relationship? And is it something that you value? And should forgiving somebody for what they did be in our own best interest? So is forgiving somebody for failing to put the dishes away when you ask them something that you can forgive them for? Does that serve the best interest of you in the relationship? Or something like somebody broke your trust. Is forgiving them really in the best interest of you and the relationship? Is forgiving them a second or third time for violating your trust really in the best interest of a relationship? Those are questions you have to answer yourself. Those are questions that you have to ask yourself and ask others. When we talk about a transgression or something that is a failure event in a relationship, this is the way in which it happens. So like we talked about listening, and listening has stages, and we walk through stage by stage, and we don't necessarily go through life under kind of labeling each stage. It kind of just happens. This is usually what happens with transgressions or failure events, something that is a violation of expectations. We confront the fact that it happened. A transgression happened, and we want to make sure that we are aware of it. Then we do this thing where we manage the emotion behind that, because any sort of violation of an expectation, whether it be implicit or explicit, there's some sort of emotional thing that happens, some sort of emotional response that happens when that happens. So you have to manage that. Then you start to think about how this applies to your relationship. So you're trying to make sense of what happened. You're trying to engage in understanding the impact of what happened. Then you decide, is seeking forgiveness or granting forgiveness how you want to proceed? So in a healthy response, retaliation is not the way you want to go, right? So hopefully the first response that you have is some sort of forgiveness seeking. So in this model in front of you, you'll see seeking forgiveness happens next. The granting of forgiveness happens. Then there's a negotiation of the values and rules. And what that means is that once something happens that is considered a transgression, a violation of expectations, you decide to seek forgiveness and it's granted. You typically will then have a conversation that says, this can't happen again. I value X expectation, whatever that may be. X could equal whatever the specific expectation you have is. And you have a conversation about how that is valuable, and that now we have an explicit expectation. It's been said out loud, it's been talked about, it's been spoken. And you have to understand that this is important, right? And yes, I forgive you for not meeting that expectation, for violating some sort of expectation, but moving forward, you have to understand that this will be part of something that you pay attention to. And that's the last piece, which is the moving on, the monitoring, and the maintaining, which means you choose to move on. You don't choose to stay in this managing of emotion and the seeking of making sense of what's going on. You are moving forward in your relationship, but your senses are heightened. You are monitoring what's going on. You're trying to maintain this relationship by trying to maintain an expectation that is now out there, that is now talked about, that is now something that is in the forefront of your mind and your relationship. When that can't happen, that's when retaliation happens. And that is this idea that you are trying to hurt somebody to even a score. You are trying to, you hurt me, I hurt you type of thing. You are trying to regain some sort of upper hand or some sort of power. And typically it comes out in some sort of aggressive behavior, which makes it, on surface level, it's obviously not a healthy way to respond to something, but just so you know, the aggressive behavior is typically what happens when you are retaliating. And what that means is that your communication style becomes aggressive. Your communication becomes manipulative. You typically do things that are trying to play some sort of emotional communication game with somebody else. You're trying to distance yourself on purpose to sort of get some sort of reaction from somebody. Again, you're trying to somehow switch the power in your favor so that you can then use that to hurt somebody else. Again, not a healthy way to respond to communication problems, but it happens. There is some sort of expectation violations that the only way we make sense of it is to retaliate. So again, I'm not saying it's a healthy behavior, but I'm saying human nature is sometimes to do that, is I want you to feel what I'm feeling. So it could happen. It's not this idea that kind of lives in the clouds, like, oh, you could potentially retaliate. I think we've all been either on the front or the back end of retaliation in a relationship when expectations aren't being met. But again, I have to emphasize, not a healthy way to deal with a relationship expectation violation. So let's talk about let's talk about long distance relationships and how this sometimes adds extra strain in expectations and the managing of the roles in a relationship. We talked about long distance relationships at the very beginning of the semester when we were talking about EMC and ways in which we have communication, both synchronous and asynchronous messaging, and how we can somehow get rid of the idea of what somebody looks like or what they're dressed like or any of those things that kind of cloud our judgment when it comes to making up ideas about somebody. Long distance relationships come back, obviously, when we're talking about relationships, because it's important to understand that the further you separate yourself from somebody, either the stronger or the weaker it's going to be. And what I mean by that is that people that have solid communication skills, people that seek forgiveness rather than retaliation, people that are very explicit with their expectations and not try to keep them quiet so that there's a violation of them. Those are typically the ones where long distance relationships stay strong, because there is expectations that are equally shared and expectations that are equally met. Long distance relationships that don't last are typically this idea that tensions get heightened when you don't have the management of those communication problems. You don't have the luxury in long distance relationships of showing up and having a face-to-face conversation with somebody, right? You don't have that luxury of being able to just pop over or set up a coffee date very quickly, or do something that when distance isn't a factor, you're able to do pretty quickly. So you have to put more energy into the deeper conversations over email, over phone, understanding that you can't read tone in email, understanding that you don't have the ability to see somebody and have that emotional connection, that emotional self-disclosure on a regular basis. Social exchange theory is huge in long distance relationships because it helps explain how we interact with each other, right? If you can recall social exchange theory from several weeks ago, it's very applicable here in long distance relationships because it helps us manage those tensions. It helps us understand what is important in a relationship and how we manage those long distance relationships and how we manage tension in a relationship. Let's talk about the relationship of social norms. So we talk about social norms and what's important for relationships and how they've changed over the years. I kind of introduced that briefly at the beginning of the first video. There are different things that happened in different years that absolutely mark a change in relationships and what we have for them. So for the discussion board post this week is going to be you picking 2 years from this list. So 1950, 1999, 2010, 2018, or 2030, and talk about the social norms for relationships. What are the societal expectations that are placed on relationships in 1950, 1999, 2010, 2018, and then look into the future. What do you forecast for 2030? And what I want you to do in your discussion board post is when you pick out the 2 years you want to talk about, I want you to talk about what those societal relationship norms were, quote unquote norms, because obviously they're different based on parts of the country or parts of the world that people lived in. But what were those social influences and how are they different today? What has changed today that influences that year? Obviously, 2018 is 2 years ago, so that's pretty recent history. But there are things that have happened since then that would reflect on 2030, that has got the ball rolling for a change in the future. So however you want to, whatever 2 years you want to pick, those are the two questions I want you to answer when you are doing your discussion board post. Furthermore, I would like you to respond to 2 of your classmates. So read through the discussion board posts of your classmates and pick out 2 different responses or posts that you feel you want to respond to. Maybe something that you read that you agree with, or maybe something you want to add to, or you would like to pose another question that your classmate can think about related to what they thought of the 2 years that they picked out and the societal norms that influenced the communication and relationships of that year. So in total for this week, you are doing 3 discussion board posts. 1 is your original post of the 2 years you're selecting. And then the 2 additional are the 2 replies you are doing to your classmates. I'm going to introduce something that I call the dark side of relationships, which seems very kind of heavy and very dark, but it is because there are relationships out there that are not healthy, that people need to end, that are a vicious cycle. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the dark side of relationships. I'm going to introduce this idea of deception in relationships, and then we'll move on to part 3 of the video and talk about more in depth what the dark side of relationships look like. So I'm going to introduce 2 theories to you. The first one is interpersonal deception theory. And that is this theory that says there is intentional and strategic manipulation of information to achieve a goal in a relationship. What that goal is defined by the individual who is doing the deceiving, is doing the manipulation. But the theory is, in interpersonal relationships, if you have a goal of something that you want out of somebody, you will actually intentionally manipulate information to achieve that goal in a relationship. The second theory is deception by omission. And that is the idea that in interpersonal relationships, we intentionally hold back information that somebody else has asked of us or has expected us to share, because you feel like you can somehow craft a relationship, because if the person doesn't know information, then you can be this person that you aren't necessarily are, but you can somehow craft this image by holding back information from the other person. And this can be information that someone has asked of you. So you're intentionally lying about information, or information that you're expected to share, which means in any normal, healthy relationship, you share whatever this piece of information may be. And again, this is going to be different in each relationship. The level of self-disclosure and what you value to be information that needs to be shared is going to be different in each relationship, but you determine that. And you are the one that sets that expectation. And when somebody is either intentionally withholding information or they are holding back information that you have asked them, so they have lied to you about information, that is deception by omission. So move on to the 3rd video. We will talk more about the dark side of relationships and more specifically deception in relationships.